we had an opportunity to talk about the budget deficit. And one of the things you said, which I think was very impactful to me, you said in response to a question I asked, certainly trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see would not be sustainable. And we had the CBO director, Elmendorf. He came out with his own analysis, which you're familiar with, sort of a sounding the alarm. And he had a couple of observations. One, he said with respect to the growing expanse of the government at the expense of the private sector, he made some observations in terms of squeezing out in the future economic growth on the private sector side. And then he said about the cost, for example, the health care bill that's moving. He said that legislation significantly expands the federal responsibility for health care costs. He said the way I would put it is that the cost curve is being raised. And he went on to express his concerns. I think one of them is in the middle of a recession. We see the government shifting. We have a government-run economy, basically, or we're beginning to move in that direction, and the deficits are appreciably higher. You know, perhaps the deficits could reach as high as $2 trillion for the short term. Earlier this year, the CBO projected that the federal government would need to go out with $2 trillion in treasuries in order to fund the deficit. And that was the short run. If you combine short and long term, they were talking $4.5 trillion over the next 2 years. The bond market has never seen such a large bond issuance in such a short period of time. So I was going to ask you about your perception on the ability of the bond market. Can we float that much, $4.5 trillion over the next 2 years? What will the results be on that? And do you have a concern with the pace at which government is growing relative to the private sector here and the added responsibilities on the public purse that Congress is in the process of enacting?
I think the ability to float large amounts in the short to near to medium term depends on the credibility of a longer term plan that brings the deficits down. If the markets don't think that you're on a sustainable path, then they will bring forward in time their concern about future deficits. So it's important to have, as I said before, a medium-term sustainability plan. I will say one thing about healthcare costs, which is that that's the most important determinant right now of our long-run fiscal situation. And even under the status quo, we have a very serious problem. And so we do need to address that problem in some way, because given the aging of our population, the increases in medical costs are going to be a huge burden on our fiscal balance.
Well, on that very subject, here's what the head of the CBO said about that. He said, as a result of those deficits, federal debt held by the public is going to soar from 41% of GDP to 60% at the end of the fiscal year 2010. This higher debt results in permanently higher spending to pay interest on that debt. Federal interest payments already amount to more than 1% of GDP. Unless current law changes, that share will rise to 2.5% by 2020. And he says the federal budget is on an unsustainable path because federal debt is going to continue to grow much faster than the economy over the long run, and large budget deficits would reduce national saving, leading to more borrowing from abroad and less domestic investment, which in turn would depress economic growth in the United States. Over time, accumulating debt would cause substantial harm to the economy. Substantial harm. Do you agree with the CBO's estimate on that subject of accumulating that amount of debt?
If fiscal policy stays on an unsustainable path, I do agree with it, yes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bernanke. I appreciate your testimony here today.